Welcome to HBR Now. I'm Joshua Makta. I'm the Chief Product Innovation Officer for Harvard Business Publishing, and I am joined by my co-hosts, my two co-hosts, Octavia Gordema, who's the career coach and founder of the 2010 agency, and the one and only Adi Ignatius.
Hello.
Hi.
Business Review. How are you guys? Good? Everyone good?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. All right. We're going to be joined today with by our special guest, who's Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who professor at University College London, where she focuses on economics and innovation. Now, don't turn away just because you heard, we have an economist on. She's incredibly fascinating. Her ideas are really compelling, and she has the ear of world leaders. It's going to be a very interesting conversation about how it is we remake our economy in a post-COVID world. Right. But before we get to that, I think we need a word from our sponsors.
Change is all around us, shaped by technology and human ingenuity. We can make it work for you and your business.
And we're back. We're back. How are you guys?
Still fine.
Still fine. Big news this week, right? Vaccine rolling out all over the United States. The stories are pretty unbelievable. Hearing, especially frontline, especially the doctors and nurses who have been going through a grueling time trying to take care of everyone, and seeing these stories. I mean, in some ways it's heartbreaking, but it also is uplifting at the same time, right as we move into holiday time. So how are you both feeling about where we are right now?
I'm feeling great about exactly as you said, Josh, just seeing the images like my paper and like news of like health workers receiving those first doses here in the United States and around the world just makes me feel good for everything we've been through.
I know. It's really kind of hard to believe. Adi, what are you thinking?
No, it's such a mixed picture. I mean, we're up to 300,000 dead. The vaccine is thrilling. Those first images of doctors getting in the U.S., getting the vaccines is great. It gets interesting now, though, because now it's, if the experts say we need to get 75% of the population, vaccinated, first of all, there are limits to that. Some of them are distribution, some of them are an unwillingness to take it. But, so the business question that probably a lot of our viewers are thinking about, should companies require their employees to be vaccinated? Can they do it? It looks like legally they can. Should they do it? Well, that's very complicated. I'm a sports fan. I'd love to go watch Red Sox games again in the spring. Do I want to sit in a crowd when I don't know if other people have been vaccinated? Already people like Ticketmaster are, creating apps that show whether you've had the vaccine. So it's just getting really interesting and interesting in the kind of business angle that this is uncharted territory for us.
Yeah, no, it's you're definitely right about that. It is hard though. Maybe it's just me in the holiday season. I mean, I just feel like when you say even the Red Sox game, I'm like, yes, maybe next year. And Octavia, you're going to come visit with us.
Yes, I would love that.
Okay.
I would love that.
Yeah, we'll force you to go see a Red Sox game. But maybe we'll all be vaccinated for it. You don't know. But there is a sort of a sense of a gift. And I think that's what our TikTok today is kind of all about, is kind of capturing that. So why don't you roll that, producer Dave? She's a doctor. She's a happy doctor. All right. That was a little weird. But anyway, good seeing you guys. You're going to come back. I'm going to introduce our guest now. So we are lucky to, as I said, have Professor Mariana Mazzucato on the show today. She has been called electrifying, which is a big deal for an economist to be called that, I think. Her ideas are definitely thought-provoking. She's the author of books such as The Entrepreneurial State and The Value of Everything. And she has a new book coming out, which you see here, Mission Economy, which is coming out next year. And she talks about how we can kind of work together, public and private sector, towards a more sustainable and equitable economy, really, and refashion our economy coming out of this COVID crisis. So I am excited to introduce Mariana. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good, good, good. Nice to see you and welcome. So I just kind of want to jump right in and start and get a sense from you, how is it that coming out of this crisis, you think we can kind of remake our economy so that, really, as I see some of your ideas, public and private coming together to really create a more equitable, more sustainable economy when it comes to technology, healthcare, environment, but how do we go about doing this or start to think about it?
So, what's interesting, I think back to when the lockdowns happened globally, which was last March. And just a month before that, some of us, some unlucky ones, were in Davos in Switzerland. And all the talk there was about stakeholder capitalism and purpose. And what I believe this period is right now that we're living through is the best possible test bed, sandbox, if you want to call it that, a policy sandbox, to see whether we've learned anything from the last kind of 10 years. Can we actually walk the talk of having a stakeholder approach to actually really building back better, which has to be so much better, because what got us both climate change, the financial crisis, the health crisis, was structurally a problematic way of doing capitalism. And you guys were just talking about the vaccine. It's not enough to race towards a vaccine. You need to govern it in such a way that actually serves the public interest. And that's very different from simply kind of emphasizing, a partnership, Pfizer, governments. We need to govern whether it's the intellectual property rights, the accessibility, the rolling out of that vaccine globally, because otherwise it's not going to work, right? If one part of the world is not immune, it will continue to cause problems. So I just think whether it's building a vaccine or how we structure these recovery funds, which are in the trillions globally, that's really important to get those details right. And unfortunately, I think if you look at what's actually happening on the ground, we don't necessarily see enough change. So what I'm interested in for 2021 is let's get serious. Let's take different examples. Vaccine is definitely one, but another one would be, in particular countries, again, the recovery of particular sectors, whether it's airlines, the hospitality industry, and look at how we can just do it fundamentally differently to build a symbiotic public-private partnership.
But I'm curious, Mariana, because coming out of the financial crisis, the financial markets actually dropped a lot more than they have now. So in some ways, it feels like maybe last time around, you talk about there's a second bite of the apple. We have another chance at this. But what's the case for optimism that if we missed it last time and the markets had dropped so much and seemed so vulnerable, now, financial markets are fairly strong. What's the case for optimism that we get it, that we do start to think about public and private investment in a different way, the way you suggest?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm sitting in Europe, even though I'm actually sitting in London, which is in the UK, which is trying to get out of Europe. Anyway, let's not go there. But in Europe, what's really interesting right now is that we have a completely different mentality from the one that we had in the financial crisis. You might remember that the recovery funds available after the financial crisis, there was really strong conditions attached to the way that countries, nations, had to promise to reduce basically their spending, their deficits, in order to access those recovery funds. This was the whole kind of Varoufakis, affair in Greece, fighting against the austerity, but also in the UK, we ended up on the back of the financial crisis, which was really caused by private debt, not public debt. We kind of missed that, point and just ended up with 10 years, almost 10 years of austerity, which is a cut in public expenditure, which got us all sorts of problems, which didn't prepare us for this health crisis because the health systems themselves were, made less resilient. Anyway, this time around in Europe, for example, we have a recovery fund that is close to €1 trillion. It's called the Next Gen EU Recovery Fund, and it's conditional not on cuts, but on investment around two grand challenges: climate change, the climate crisis, we should call it, and digitalization. There's another pot separate to the recovery fund, which is about building stronger health systems across Europe. So that's already super interesting, right? Like you have the whole region saying, we're going to really build back better, but that requires investment, long-term investment and public sector capacity. Now, the real question is, do these different member states across Europe have that capacity? And unfortunately, as we've also seen in the UK, there's been a how can you say, diminishing public sector capacity even to govern the crisis itself. So we've over-relied, for example, on consulting companies. We have Deloitte, doing a lot of the test and trace, to the point that a Tory Lord recently, Lord Agnew, said we have infantilized government by this over-reliance on consulting companies. So I think this is a huge wake-up call globally to actually invest within government institutions at the city level, the state level, regional, national, et cetera, in order to really govern, a crisis of this sort. And what's really interesting, if you look globally, you have countries like Vietnam or regions like Kerala in India, which have actually done quite well. And that's because it's on the back of a lot of new thinking in terms of their own public administration.
Right.
And I just think there's something really interesting, actually, for Harvard Business Review to start looking at, which is what does it mean to have kind of strategy, decision sciences, organizational behavior, all these words that are usually just in business schools, brought to governments to give them that dynamic capacity to really co-create markets, co-create value, and not always be in the back foot, kind of too little, too late, fixing what economists call market failures.
Now, to get a lot of these innovations, I mean, you sort of rightfully point out that the governments invest a lot in innovation that entrepreneurs then take advantage of. And I wonder, entrepreneurs put a lot of they risk, it's hard work, and you feel like you need a lot of them out there to get one apple, right? And, to the extent that there's some huge reward, people are motivated. So I think you're basically saying, look, the government needs to take more of, that they're partners in creating value, as they say, they're adversaries in claiming it, and the government needs to claim more. But how much of that might be a disincentive then for, so many entrepreneurs to really put the hard work in necessary to come up with the innovations that drive us forward?
Right. So you're now making my heart beat quickly. So, that's the myth, right? I mean, this is all a social science. We can't talk about the truth. But, what I argued in my book, The Entrepreneurial State, was that this thing here, which we all have, or we have something like this, are smart products. They're smart and not stupid. Talk to my idiotic iPhone. No, we talk to our smart iPhones, because of all the technology within it that actually makes it smart. So the internet, GPS, Siri, the touchscreen display, these were all invested in by public organizations, whether it was DARPA with the internet, the Navy with GPS. But what's even more important is that these were public organizations focused on solving problems. So the internet came about from the drive to actually get the satellites to communicate. GPS was a result of the Navy wanting to know how to, position its ships much more strategically, if you want, in the oceans. So the real question today is not whether the state's important or not. Of course it is. Just looking at our smart products, is what are the real problems today that should be driving that kind of problem solving? One, that's the first question. And these are usually social, not just technological problems, around climate change, which is a wicked problem because it requires political and regulatory change as well, not just technological. But also the second question is, how can we actually foster a much more symbiotic, mutualistic partnership between the public sector and the private sector? So if you look at, Silicon Valley, huge amounts of public sector investment, and yet this is a region which has, not necessarily benefited from a reinvestment of the rewards back into what's actually good for the public, right? Just look at the, school system in that part of the world. And so how do we, govern the rewards in such a way that we get out of this kind of socialization of risk, privatization of rewards, but, how can we do that in a practical way? And I think there's different ways to do that. One is to make sure that we are, in fact, focused on the big problems of our time. So not just gadgets, but we definitely should be confronting, again, the digital divide, climate issues around health. And that should be really driving these public organizations of the DARPA type, ARPA-E, NIH, et cetera. But also, how can we embed within those funding structures certain types of conditions? The NIH, to me, is the most stark example of where we get it wrong in the United States. So you have $40 billion a year being put into the system by a public institution, the National Institutes of Health, on drug innovation. And then somehow we allow the patents to be abused. They are too wide. so used for strategic reasons, too strong, hard to license, too upstream, so the research itself is privatized. That's not what really patents should be for. It should be much more downstream. And the prices of the drugs, including, by the way, the vaccines that are currently coming out, somehow don't reflect that public contribution. And if we look back in history in the US, it's not really how it used to get done. In fact, in some of the most innovative periods, coming to your question, in US history, where you had companies like AT&T setting up Bell Labs, which was fundamental for the IT revolution globally and in the US, Bell Labs actually came from a condition that the US government set for AT&T to retain its monopoly status. They had to reinvest their profits back into the real economy, into innovation and big innovation beyond telecoms. And Bell Labs was the answer. So this kind of issue around conditionality, how do you get a public-private collaboration, whether it's in health, whether it's around the digital divide, or let's just call it the ICT, digital AI revolution, or the energy revolution, that's really nested within a different form of purpose-driven, stakeholder-driven partnership? That's the question. I mean, the incentives obviously are there. The patents are there. The question is, how do we govern that patent system? The public funding is there. The question is, how do we govern that public funding to be more, again, symbiotic, so that the outcomes are structured in such a way that citizens benefit?
Yeah, and I mean, clearly the government in the United States invested a lot in grants and things to get the internet going, and they may have wanted things that weren't necessarily the right. Now we would think more like the conditions, as you're talking about it. What are the conditions to actually make a better environment and create value in ways that are more productive for all? Now, I want to remind people that you're watching HPR Now with Mariana Mazzucato, who's our guest. And I'm going to bring on our co-host now, Mariana, to ask you a few more questions and get questions from the audience as well.
Yeah, for the audience, do type your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible later. But so, Mariana, I want to follow up a little bit on the public-private partnership question. The demonization of the public sector, seems to have been an intentional and very successful strategy of the kind of free market fetishists in the U.S. and elsewhere for years. It's probably driven a lot of the best and brightest out of the public sector, which makes it a kind of a self-fulfilling critique. So, I mean, you talk about sort of bringing it back or restoring, the role of the public to what it can be. How do you do that? I mean, it's fairly broken now. We're not where we were maybe, when Bell Labs was doing its thing. How do we bring that back?
So I think the answer is, it's a great question, and the answer is, quite complex. I think there's different points. The first is the framing. As I already mentioned, this idea that the public sector is at best there to fix a market failure, that's the wrong narrative, it's the wrong framing, it's the wrong theory, which ends up informing policy. So I think the first thing is we just need to admit that this is about the shaping of markets and the co-creation of value. Right? It's not that you have value creators on one side and then the market somehow forms and then the government comes in to fix the problems when they arise. In fact, all the different examples we gave, both the technology in our smart products, but also if you look at renewable energy and health innovation, the state was an investor in the actual value creation. That's just a fact, if you ask me. Again, I want to admit that this is all subjective. It's not nuclear physics. So once you admit that, the question is, what does that then mean for the organization of those public institutions? So they need to actually have a remit and make it explicit, talk about it, kind of come out of the closet that you are a value co-creator, you're a market shaper. And that means you're not there to level the playing field. Just think of all the language: leveling, at best enabling, de-risking. You are going to perhaps tilt the playing field towards a direction that you believe is important for society because you're public. Especially democratically elected, where our governments are democratically elected, not in countries with a dictator, say, you owe your resources back to what's good for citizens. So then the question is, how do you make sure that you actually have conversations about the public good, public value, public purpose? And unfortunately, even in the US, where you actually have had a lot of government investments in things like the internet, these discussions about then how to govern these areas in such a way that they're good for the public interest and not just private profit haven't been as eloquent as they have been, for example, in the BBC again, I'm sitting in the UK where the BBC, I know, great public broadcaster. I'm sure you all, when you used to travel, would watch BBC News in your hotel rooms. They have always been driven by this notion of public value, which is simply not talked about in business schools or probably even in HBR great journals, right? So they didn't just limit themselves to fixing the market in an area like documentaries about giraffes in a region or high quality news. They also did soap operas. They also did talk shows driven by an internal debate of what they thought was really kind of path breaking for society. So they did EastEnders, a soap opera about the working class, basically, instead of just Dallas and Dynasty, which, your American viewers will know what I'm talking about, at least the old ones like me. Anyway, so all these discussions about the metrics within the organization, which of course private sector organizations have had recently around ESG kind of targets when they want to become good companies, we actually need to bring that back to the public sector. And that's going to make it more exciting to work in it. If you're a co-creator of value, if you're an investor of first resort, not just a lender of last resort, and if you internally have a dynamic debate of what's the right thing, what's the wrong thing to do, it makes it an exciting place to work. If you're just fixing markets, enabling, and at best de-risking some mythological risk taker that's out there, it's kind of boring. Of course, you'd rather go work in a risk-taking company.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just follow quickly then on the private side of the public-private question. I sensed a certain skepticism, maybe dismissive-ness in your comments about being in Davos and in your book. Well,
they won't invite me back now, I guess.
No. Well, you need to be there. But anyway, so it's easy to say that companies are just profit motivated, that they're talking the talk but not walking the walk. But or is it significant that after 50 years of companies kind of lining up with a Milton Friedman-esque approach to, we have to serve shareholders, that's our fiduciary duty, that's probably required by law, the conversation has moved. And it's fine to be cynical, and you have to, as you said, that there need to be test cases. But it seems to me something significant has happened in the boardrooms of big U.S. corporations and European corporations, that we're not in the same place that we were certainly 50 years ago, but maybe even 5 years ago.
I agree, and I didn't mean to be dismissive. I know it's easy to sound dismissive when it's late in the day and you're. No.
Well, Davos is like shooting.
Yeah. No. What I'd like to say. Yeah. I mean, what I really meant to say, and I guess this is dismissive, is to say, look, let's just stop talking about this. Right? The notion of stakeholder value is actually not new. Let's do it. Let's actually do it. And the only way to do it is to do it in a super practical way, which is actually to test out what it looks like. If we can't do it with vaccine production, if we can't do it with a therapy for COVID, which is remdesivir, which is being put out by Gilead, and even though it's had huge amounts of public, investment, it's going for over $3,000 a dosage. That doesn't feel very purpose-driven. So my point is that purpose, a really great concept that we shouldn't be dismissive about, needs to go to the center of the system. It can't just be inside a discussion about corporate governance. It has to go, for example, at the center of how public and private relate one to another. And so with COVID, we have in the US over $2 trillion being put by the government into the system. In Europe, over $1 trillion. In Japan, similarly. What does it look like for those funds, which are at the center of the public-private relationship, to actually be purpose-driven? Or even pre-COVID, one example I'll give you just to be super practical is the steel sector, which is not a sexy sector that you probably think about very much, but globally is in trouble and has been asking to be bailed out and helped globally by governments, including in the US. In Germany, the funds that were given by the public bank called the KfW in Germany to the steel sector was conditional on that sector reducing its material content, which they ended up doing through repurpose, reuse, recycle methods throughout their whole value chain. They're now one of the most innovative and green, sustainable steel sectors in the world. And they didn't do that because they woke up and said, we need to be purpose purpose-driven or joined the Business Roundtable. They did it because they had to in order to get the government assistance. And I think this point about conditionalities, however, will be really strong if we don't see it as a penalty, a condition like a mother. I've got 4 kids. I'm putting conditions on them all the time. You can't eat until you do your room. That's not really the right spirit. It's actually the spirit of the Business Roundtable, which is to say, let's do this stuff better. Let's be long-termist. Let's do what's good for the community, the planet, and workers, and the environment. That's the planet, I guess. But let's do it in a practical way. So I just think that COVID-19 and 2021, which is the year on the back of that, after a terrible year, let's get our hands dirty and get serious about doing this in the vaccine production and the therapies and our health systems, in the Green Deal, bringing it back to the agenda, but at the center of the recovery funds.
So just a reminder for everyone watching, if you have a question for Professor Mazzucato, please do post it in the comments because we're getting those shortly. Mariana, you're about to launch your new book, Mission Economy, which will be published in January in the UK and in March in the US. In that book, you advocate that we need a moonshot to rethink the capacities and role of government within the economy and the society. The moment we're in, as you said, is pivotal. Earlier in this conversation, you talked about Kerala and what's happening in Vietnam. Which governments, in your opinion, are leading the way, and what are they doing specifically that stands out? Mariana?
Great. I hope you can still hear me.
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Can you still hear me? I think I shut out there for a minute.
Yeah, keep going.
Yes.
Yes, you're back.
You got it back.
Did you hear my question, Mariana?
Can you hear me? Oh, dear.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Yes.
You hear us.
God, I love live.
Yeah, can you hear me? Am I back? Oh, God. Okay.
You're back.
But, this is Brexit. I'm telling you, it must be Brexit.
We're in a pandemic. We're in different countries.
No, to be honest, it is probably these kids. They're all back with their digital thing.
No, it might be me. I think when I host, this seems to happen, and I know Audie's going to give me a hard time about it now.
Quick answer. No, I'm sure the problem's on my end. So, look, I usually say it's not about the country, it's about the organizations and certain things that are happening in those countries. And I can point to you really interesting things happening even in countries that are not getting their national priorities straight. But let me just give you a good example of a country. Sweden currently has a mission. And maybe I should just backtrack. The point of the book is to say, we have these sustainable development goals, 17 of them. We actually agreed on them globally in 2005, only 5 years ago, right? This is not that long ago. What does it mean to turn those challenges, societal challenges, into moonshots? So you go from the very broad 17 goals into moonshots that are inspirational, right? So the Clean Oceans one, SDG 14, you make that a plastic-free ocean. And all of a sudden that opens up the possibility of all sorts of collaborations, innovation across many different sectors. Going to the moon required innovation in nutrition, electronics, materials, software. To a large extent, the whole software industry was a spillover trying to get to the moon. But especially what's interesting with the Apollo program is that the procurement policy, so the tools that government used to relate to the private sector, really fostered lots of bottom-up innovation. It wasn't technocratic. They definitely had a top-down goal, but how they got there was definitely bottom-up. And that's what we need to do with the SDGs. So again, the plastic-free ocean one, you can imagine all sorts of different experiments and projects that would be required to do that. But we need to then bring that down to the design of the tools themselves, whether it's procurement, grants, loans, prize schemes. Sweden, just coming now to your question, is interesting because they've set a mission nationally, which is about a fossil-free welfare state. And that's quite broad, but it's also quite specific, right? Public education, public health, public transport. And then go even further, school meals, right? With COVID, we've discovered that so many kids, their only healthy meal, or in some cases only meal, is in school. So of course we need to make sure those school meals continue to get delivered. So in the UK, for example, there's been a voucher scheme. So even during the lockdown, the kids had access to it. But we should make sure these school meals themselves are fostering innovation across the whole value chain of production, distribution, and consumption. And Sweden has a healthy, tasty, so not just IKEA meatballs, sustainable school meal mission. And I just think that's a really good example because it's so easy just to focus again on the kind of quantum computing, AI, big data stuff. But the stuff we do every day can be really kind of boring and static or super innovative. And getting governments to think about their whole spectrum of different things that they deliver every day for people, from public transport, public housing, and school meals, as a funnel for innovation, investment, collaboration with the private sector to deliver on public goals. That's what I mean by the moonshot approach.
Wonderful. So before we go to audience questions, I do have a question for you about Europe. With the December 31st deadline for a trade agreement between the EU and the UK approaching, the risk of a no-deal Brexit is mounting. There have been numerous headlines and studies about the financial impact of Brexit on the UK economy, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the broader economic ramifications for the remaining EU member states. When we consider the fallout of potentially a no-deal Brexit coupled with the economic contraction as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, can Europe bounce back?
Well, Europe can definitely bounce back. And Europe is currently, again, I really think the recovery program in Europe is incredibly ambitious. It's conditional on investments around huge public problems around the climate crisis, as I mentioned, digitalization, and strengthening our health systems. The real warning sign to the rest of the member states, and I'm Italian, but grew up in New Jersey and live in the UK. So I'm this weird kind of, animal so I feel that I can lecture people about what to beware of in all these different countries because they're all, interesting to learn from, is that what actually drives business investment, and, listen to Warren Buffett when he talks about this, it's not a tax cut or the cost of doing something. It's the perception of where future opportunities lie. And the real problem with Brexit is that in a country which was already experiencing lagging productivity and really lagging investment, right? So GDP is not a perfect measure, but you can track investment, the business investment side of things. By reducing the size of the market that the UK is in, that reduces business investment even more than it was before, because the perception of the future market and also opportunities that are available by being within a global market that can actually negotiate properly with the US and China has massively diminished. Now, but that wouldn't be enough. What's also interesting is Europe has historically actually been the place where real debate and struggles for improving environmental conditions, working conditions happened. And those then trickle down at the member state level. And what's so interesting with Brexit is the first thing that the UK government did is say, oh, finally, we don't have to abide by these environmental regulations anymore, or, working regulations. And that's such a backwards movement. We need to progress. We need to go, do what we've been talking about, which is bring public purpose, challenge-oriented thinking, and bring different forces to the table, which include, of course, labor unions, which have historically got us the weekend. Do people realize that the weekend was fought for? The 8-hour workday was fought for. So really the question is, what are these modern kind of struggles that we should all be talking about? And what are the forces that we need to get there? And is just building walls, whether it's Trump's wall or the Brexit wall, going to help us get there? Or is it actually opening ourselves up to not just international competition, which is often talked about, but that debate about what we need as a society to be more inclusive and sustainable? And unfortunately, the Brexit debate has brought us backwards on that. And so Europe is bringing us forwards, and it's too bad. And I really hope that the decision will be reversed somehow. We'll see that a no-deal Brexit is terrible, or even a crappy deal Brexit is terrible. But anyway, this is too political.
So I do just want to share some feedback that we have from our highly engaged audience. We have hello from Luxembourg, from Shiva, my favorite economist. And Christopher says, I would give anything to be on this call and join the discussion. So thank you for being with us today. I do want to share a question from Rachel in Minnesota, your professor, and she's asking, what role does higher education play in supporting the role of public sector innovation? And can there be better partnerships?
Oh, what a great question. So I think it's, and I'm not sure if I'm tackling this in the right way, but first of all, education is fundamental. The reason I actually set up the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London 3 years ago, is that I believe that better policy needs new training, needs also new education for civil servants globally, to get them out of this notion of kind of new public management, public choice theory, which has basically convinced global bureaucrats that the best they can do is, again, fix markets, and that government failure is even worse than market failure. So take up as little space as you can and then get out of the way. So that's one side of the answer, which is I actually think we need a new education program for bureaucrats. There's no reason that the word bureaucratic should be a negative word. We need bureaucracies. We just need dynamic, creative bureaucracies. But the other question is education, education, education. That is really the biggest leveler. Having an education system which is kind of a two-track one. So one, say, private education, and then the public education system being underfinanced is a key driver of inequality. But that's not necessarily about higher education. That's literally from day one when you enter a nursery and when you finish high school. And I went to Princeton High School in New Jersey, a public high school. And unfortunately, what I've seen, definitely in London and in the U.S. and in Italy, is an underinvestment, not just in terms of money, but the imagination of what public education is for. And can I say something super provocative?
Of course.
Yeah, definitely.
Just abolish private education. If you had pushy mothers in every school, I just actually think public education is something we should all be talking a lot more about and strengthening it, just like we should strengthen public health systems. But higher education, in terms of universities, it's just so fundamental. We know that. I mean, so much of the research that has led to both the vaccine production in Oxford, which, by the way, is a public university, state university, and also the innovation that, again, got us Google's algorithm through a grant given by the National Science Foundation to Stanford University. You could just go on and on. It's, public education and public research is fundamental. The problem is that by just assuming that it's important without actually bringing it to the table and redesigning how we actually bring together academia, public funding, private sector funding, but also the small, medium, large companies and, to different degrees, the science industry linkages, then we're missing the trick of how to actually engage public education with the greatest problems of our time. And I mentioned before, I think I did, that it's not just about STEM subjects. It's not just natural sciences that are important. It's also the humanities, poetry, literature, the arts are so fundamental for making us think differently. And it's not a coincidence that the plastic-free mission that I mentioned before has become very much in the mind of kids. And I have 4 of them. They all know the plastic-free mission on the back of a documentary that was made by David Attenborough called The Blue Planet. So bringing the cultural sector and the humanities in academia, in higher education, to the table in these discussions, I think is so important. It helps us reimagine what kind of lives we want to be living and how to live together in a better way.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm going to go to one more question from the audience. Earlier, you talked about the sustainability goals that the General Assembly of the UN put in place 5 years ago for 2030. And I know you were recently announced as a chair of the Council for the World Health Organization. Vera from Rome has asked, what role can the UN and other international organizations have in fostering private and public partnerships?
I think it is through the SDGs, which, by the way, weren't handed down from the UN. There was a massive stakeholder engagement. They were debated, they were chosen globally. And the UN convened that conversation and then allowed these really ambitious 17 goals with 169 targets beneath them to be at the center stage. And I think what the UN should then do is really make sure that the everyday stuff we do, especially that governments do, because in the end, it's the governments sort of at the table with the United Nations, that they bring those SDGs to the center. And in some ways, coming back to Adi's point, the private sector in some ways has been leading on this by having a debate, at least in the Davos kind of areas, about ESG and beyond ESG, just making purpose and the sustainability targets to be more relevant for company governance. But what does it mean for governments to bring them to the center of what they do, whether it's industrial strategy, which is not just a list of sectors to support, but how all the different sectors work together to deliver those goals. Innovation policy, procurement policy, again, a huge chunk of government budgets, often over 30% is dedicated to procurement, how they purchase stuff, whether it's desks for schools, hospital beds, cement for the roads. You can bring sustainability to the center of those processes of purchasing, as well as obviously even more so with investing. So I think the more the UN can help build that capacity on the ground to bring the SDGs away from just being this abstract kind of philosophical point, as important as ethics and morality and solidarity is, to the everyday. Make it boring, make it so we all have to do it. It's embedded in the design of how the system works.
Mariana, thank you so much for joining us. You clearly have this very energized fan base and lots of questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We tried. Thank you, Octavia, for bringing as much feedback as you could. And thanks to my co-host. Thanks to the sponsor as well, to our sponsor. I also just want to let you know we're off for the next couple of weeks. We're back on January 5th. And then on January 19th, when we end our season, we'll have our special guest back, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Not a moment too soon. That should be a lot of fun. So thank you all for tuning in, and have a safe and pleasant holiday. And we're back. It's the HBR Now after show. We're drinking.
Yes.
Now you're fixing.
You're a couple hours ahead of us, so
Yeah. This is a good one. Pecorino. I'm Italian. So my husband has abandoned me for 7 weeks to go to his other, no, just kidding. He doesn't have another family. He went on a film, production. He's a film producer. He's just come back and brought wine and salami.
Was he on location filming something?
Yeah, which is actually quite exceptional because most film production he does artsy fartsy films that win every festival but don't make enough money.
So I have a question about something we didn't get to, which is, you write a lot about how we're not sort of measuring the right things when we think about the value of the economy. But that discussion often then gets into a discussion of happiness and a discussion of universal basic income, maybe, and ultimately a discussion about why do we live? Do we live to work? Do we work to live? And I find, you talk about things like universal basic income and people say, you can't have that because our whole identity and self-worth is wrapped up in work. I'm not so sure it is. I could imagine a different sense of happiness and fulfillment that isn't that, but you've researched this a lot more. I'm really curious what you think about that.
So I began the book, The Value of Everything, with this quote by Plato, if you can call it a quote, that storytellers rule the world. And I really think we need to change the narrative. So my problem with universal basic income is less about the economics of it, but the narrative. It still feels like a handout. It feels like, someone else is creating wealth, and then somehow the money arrives to government, which then writes a check to citizens. Whereas I prefer the notion of a citizen's share, or citizen's dividend, or a public wealth fund, which it puts the citizen who has helped to create that value in a way that, by the way, Warren Buffett is always reminding us. I think I mentioned before, he always says, I have benefited from a massive amount of social value that's been created. Bill Gates himself often admits that. Peter Thiel doesn't, by the way. Let's not name check too many people. It's probably one of your sponsors.
Not now.
Anyway,
he was going to come in next week, but well.
I'm not embarrassed you doing this. So admitting that wealth is co-created by all sorts of different actors, not only the public sector, but all the workers and citizens, that are part of that, means that should then be redistributed back. And that's about pre-distribution, not just redistribution. So I don't know if I'm putting out too much lingo there, but the reason I like the citizen's share, the citizen's dividend, or public wealth funds, it is about getting the conditions right ex ante, not just picking up the mess afterwards with a check that's sent to people.
I think that's what politicians like Andrew Yang were trying to get across with that kind of dividend notion. And then Adi, to the point, like I think his point at least was that people actually do find meaningful work that they can't really afford to do. It's just other ways of creating value, which is what I love a lot of, like your conversation around, value extraction for just moving assets around basically, but not necessarily doing anything to move society forward. But people get really rich that way.
Yeah, well, what's interesting, again, going back to the book on value, I luckily just wrote one chapter, but it could have been much longer, on 400 years of thinking about value. And I went back to the physiocrats who were writing about this in the 1700s. And the first ever spreadsheet was made in the 1700s by this guy, Francois Connet, who was one of the physiocrats. And they were really worried about all the value that was being extracted out of the system by the landlords. And they called the landlords the sterile class, literally sterility, in the sense that they would put the reproduction of the system, these interesting concepts, at risk. And I think if you look at global finance, again, in the UK where I'm sitting, 80% of finance goes back to finance. Finance, insurance, and real estate. The acronym is FIRE. We should tell Greta Thunberg, because she says, the planet is on fire. We're not acting. Actually, the financial system is also on fire because it's been financing itself. And so how do you get that financial, system to be reinvested, or global finance to be reinvested back into the real economy, and the real economy that's actually driven by, again, goals. And that's not because a government official's telling them that, but that's actually what makes our, global system more reproductive. And that's why this concept of the circular economy is really important, making sure that we're both reducing waste, but we actually have this kind of circular system where the value that's being created is reinvested back into what makes us all better off and the planet more resilient to crises, whether it's a health crisis or a climate crisis. But they were talking about that 300 years ago. And the problem with Trump is he kind of brought us back even 100 years earlier than the physiocrats. And that was the mercantilist period, where all they cared about was exchange rates, terms of trade, the 1651 Navigation Acts. So it was all about building barriers and thinking about who's screwing who. Sorry, this is the after party, right?
That's okay.
Yeah. You can go blue now.
Yeah.
The sponsors
I'm the only one drinking out of a false wine cup, so no one knows if it's green tea or white wine. But so I think what's really important that Biden can do now is to kind of transform that, make America great again is not about the mercantilist period. It's about an investment program. But what are we investing in? And who's deciding? And how can we get citizens to believe again and why politics matters? So also bringing in citizen assemblies to be part of, the discussion about what we need to be solving.
Yeah, it's but the finance people are the most productive people on the planet.
Yeah.
we have so many good plans, and I think about the good plans for climate change and net zero. They cost a lot of money, and I can be optimistic when I read the plans, and then pessimistic just because I don't quite see where all the money is going to come from to lead the transformations that we need, some of which you've talked about, some of which are climate related. Am I being too pessimistic here?
Well, you need to look at the numbers. $4 trillion having been spent on share buybacks in the last 10 years. That's a wasted opportunity, right? So the money's there. The question is, where is it being spent on? And so you could argue, yeah, fine, but companies can do what they want with their money. The question is, right, where did that money come from? Where did those profits come from? So as soon as we, again, admit this massive social, collective value creation process, there should be much more discussion of where these funds, the revenues, actually are going. And it's not a lack of funds, it's a misdirection. And also in terms of governments, when we go to war, which we do, World War I, World War II, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, whatever, you can go on and on. Have you ever heard, even in the movies about these wars, anyone saying, oh dear, we don't have the money, we can't go? They create the money. When it's war, we create the money. So money can be created. That's the whole MMT debate, modern monetary theory in the US. I think one of the problems with that debate is that it's still a political process, right? So again, the narrative, the discussion of what we say is urgent, that's what needs to change. So making these social goals around our welfare states, like, again, public education, public health, the future of mobility, which is sort of a public transport, but not only problem, at the center stage of how we bring together different actors and say, this is urgent. This is Greta's point. Greta Thunberg, 16 now, what is she, 17 now? She says, if your house is on fire, you don't sit there and debate, oh, should I leave? What should I bring with me? That book or that quilt? You just get the hell out, So when you say something is an emergency, you act. The problem is we've allowed security concerns and wartime scenarios to be seen as an emergency, or climate change when it's too late, when the fires or the floods, are out there. It's kind of too late to wait for, fires and floods to be, really at that kind of urgency and emergency phase. So how can we proactively, preemptively say that these, I always go back to the SDGs. I'm going to keep doing that until we actually solve them, that those are urgent, but they have to be nested within conversations that are local. They're kind of too abstract. You have to bring it to the city level, to the regional level, to the national level, and make sense of it. But the only way to do that is to bring different voices. And that's where, sorry, I will shut up in a second. I do think that we need to benefit from the Black Lives Matter movement, the Fridays for the Future movement, and bring movements, make this a movement. We need to make it a movement, so bringing different voices to the table for the design phase. It can't just be reactive.
So I actually have a question. It's a little bit off topic from some of the great stuff you were just discussing, but I think it ties in, and it's a little seasonal. And it reminded me of some of the stuff you were saying about, communities and value. As an economist, what is your favorite Christmas movie or holiday movie? I'm thinking of things like It's a Wonderful Life and A Christmas Carol with Scrooge, who is just a near version of, someone who's a landlord and a debt collector. I don't know if there's like a holiday movie that you watch as an economist and think, they still do that today.
I mean, the great thing of It's a Wonderful Life is it just made people realize why having, a kind of a Federal Reserve System and the guarantees is important. We kind of forget that these things that we all benefit from came out of a crisis. But also just the deeply personal, how it affects people, because you go to this kind of systemic change that we need. What's the equivalent of innovation like that in the Federal Reserve today to defend us against the biggest risks we have, which aren't just financial risks, but climate risks? What would be the equivalent of that, right? If we're going to make It's a Wonderful Life in 30 years around climate and not banking.
Yeah, it's not snowing in Bedford Falls at that point.
Yeah, but what I love about that was that it was so deeply personal. There was families both within the banking sector and not. And I feel like, this comes back to my trade union point. People forget that stuff we take for granted was fought for. Often people died for things that we all are benefiting from. And, labor's, sorry, I sound very ideological, but labor's share is at a record low. The profit share is at a record high. That's not going to be solved by an economist. That's not going to be solved by a politician or a CEO of the, Davos type. Sorry, I'm going to dismiss Davos again. That's going to be solved by a battle. And how all these different forces, the business community, the different public forces, but citizens are battling it out. I just think we need to talk about that more. And actually, the Harvard Business Review should talk about it more, because we should remember it was movements that even got us the AIDS drug. It's what got us birth control. It's what got, the suffragettes, the voting, it's what got us the civil rights movement. These are huge innovations, social innovations.
Well, the question is, how do you change the world? I mean, we've published some great pieces in the last few years. First of all, on, breaking down the whole concept of shareholder primacy, that it is, flawed logic and not even really a matter of law. We did a really great piece, The Case Against Stock Buybacks.
Yeah. With Bill
last week on the show, we had Dan Schulman, who was, the only Davos guy I found who's actually willing to talk about labor. I mean, usually when labor comes up or the power of unions, everyone's like, no, I'm all for the stakeholders, but, union, I'm out of here. So
Yeah.
The question is, how does change happen? And it probably happens when you don't realize it. It's an accumulation of little moves, and then something changes, or maybe it's revolution. I don't know, but we're in there fighting the fight. You know, the system's broken, and we're all trying to do what we can to try to fix it.
I agree with you.
All right. I think we have to let you go, right?
Yeah, I know we do. Yes, this is great. You have to come back.
I will. Invite me back once the book's out.
Yeah.
You
I'll go
go with
chapter
us.
by chapter.
Pre-order the book.
Actually,
Yeah,
a
buy the
recipe
book.
book. It's a recipe book. It's
Would
it's
it be
the
this
how-to.
We
Yeah,
want
yeah.
the book. Mariana, we want the book.
Yeah, of course you want. Wait, what do you mean you want the book?
Well, we thought we might get like, some sort of sneak preview or
Oh, I
something.
see. I think you wanted like on
He
sale.
wants a signed copy.
No, I mean, I'll buy the book.
Take a signed copy.
But in the U.S., it's out in March, so we've got 3 months to organize the next session. I guess.
Pre-order now.
Maybe
I'll
we're
walk you through it.
maybe we're together and we actually, have a real conversation because, we get together in person in London or something.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. But until then, happy holidays.
Have a
Happy
great
New Year.
Mariana.
Ciao, ciao.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you.
So long. See you later,
Take care.
producer Dave.
Bye-bye. Thanks.